Hi, welcome to the House Bill 3834 Cybersecurity Awareness Training video. We've partnered at Triton Consulting to administer the program for special purpose districts in conjunction with Red Tiger Security to deliver the curriculum specially tailored for you. As you may know, the 86th legislative session of the state of Texas passed House Bill 3834. This requires all elected officials to have completed a cybersecurity awareness training curriculum. We have assembled this with Red Tiger Security, and today to instruct on the curriculum we have Jonathan Pole from Red Tiger Security that I'd like to introduce now.
Hi, thank you, David. Yes, this is Jonathan Pole with Red Tiger Security, and I'm a degreed electrical engineer with 20 years of experience in industrial automation, controls, and cybersecurity. Our firm has created a lot of cybersecurity training since 2009, and that's the reason why we partnered with Triton Consulting to create this cybersecurity training awareness program for you guys. Okay, before we jump into the training, let's look at a quick overview of the topics we're going to cover. We split up this 1-hour course into 2 sections. The first section is going to give you an explanation of cybersecurity terms and definitions. We're going to go over CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We're also going to look at what the term information security means, and also different forms of locations of information and the people that are responsible for safeguarding those things. The second half of the first part of the course is going to jump into safeguarding unauthorized access to information systems and secure facilities, and some best practices for securing that information, both from a physical perspective and a cyber perspective. The second half of the course, we're going to dive a little deeper into what actually constitutes a cybersecurity attack. What needs to be in place in order for your systems to be compromised. We're going to look at terms like threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. I know these terms sound very similar, but we're going to break them down for you to understand how a threat can take an exploit to overtake a vulnerable system. We're going to model several different threat actors so you can understand the types of threats that are out there and some of their motivation why they might be interested in the information that you guys are supposed to be safeguarding. We're also going to look at risk and risk platforms. So securing information properly is a main part of all cyber risk platforms. We're going to look at the NIST cybersecurity framework because that is a framework that applies to all critical sectors, including wastewater and water treatment. And lastly, we look at when you do detect a threat to your system, what are the proper ways to respond and recover your operations from that threat? So let's start with section 1.1, Principles of Information Security. So the NIST publication 800-12 is an interesting read. It's available on the NIST website for free download, and it defines cybersecurity as the protection afforded to an automated information system in order to obtain the applicable objectives of preserving the integrity, availability, and confidentiality of not only the information, but the systems and hardware that are part of that system, including also telecommunications, which is the transmission of that data from its source to its destination. And in terms of securing information, confidentiality, integrity, and availability are always defined as the pillars of security. And those 3 areas of security are what we want to break down for you. First, let's look at integrity. Integrity has 2 facets, data integrity and system integrity. And you can think of integrity as making sure that the data does not change from its source to its destination. So if you think about this like, let's say a water meter on the side of your house. The water meter data is registering how much water you're consuming, and that data needs to remain the same from the meter all the way through the telecommunications infrastructure to the back-end billing systems to your invoice. If that system does not have integrity, that means someone has been able to alter that data in between the source and the destination. And so integrity is one of the 3 main pillars of security. We're also going to look at availability, and availability is a term we apply to a system, make sure that it's available to the people that want to use the system. It's not available to those who want to take advantage of the system. And you want to have a system with high availability so that the users have access to the system and its data. So confidentiality is another form of the three pillars that form up information security. And the reason why we want to have a system with high confidentiality is to make sure those that do not have a need to know do not have access to that data. So let's look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability in terms of what we want to prevent. Okay, so we use confidentiality to prevent information from being disclosed to third parties that shouldn't have access to that information. We use integrity to ensure that the data or information does not change from its source to its destination. And the reason we want to have a system with high availability is to make sure that it's not obliviated, that it's available for use for those who need to access it. So in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those three concepts are applied to business IT systems differently than they're applied to real-time critical infrastructure systems. For example, if you have a banking system or a business system, confidentiality of the information is the most important feature. So if a record of someone's salary is compromised, you immediately lock down the system, find out how the data leak happened, and then restore the system back to normal use. On a real-time system, if confidentiality is compromised, you can't shut off the system. You know, power systems, water systems, airport runway systems have to be up all the time. So availability is the highest, most critical point in the system. And so by understanding the differences between business IT systems and industrial control systems and real-time systems, you can understand how these three areas of confidentiality, integrity, and availability play in making sure the systems are always available to those that need to use it. The term information security applies to a whole framework to secure not just the data, but the processes, methodologies involved to secure it. And the SANS Institute brought us this definition of information security. So it goes more than just making sure a piece of paper is put in a locked cabinet, for example. Information security is more than just having a firewall, more than just having an antivirus program. It's the whole process around how you secure information. Also, information security is part of every single risk framework. We give you one here for reference. This is the NIST cybersecurity framework. This was created in partnership with between the White House and NIST in 2014, and it's been used in every critical infrastructure sector since then. And the NIST framework indicates that you should have security controls that cover these 5 functional areas. So first, you need to be able to identify those parts of your assets, your information that is important to you, that needs to be protected, that you manage those assets properly, you have proper governance over those assets, and you have a strategy around how to manage risk for those assets. And then you also need to put protective controls in place to prevent unauthorized access to that system or to that information, provide awareness and training to those people who are working in those fields that are responsible for protecting that information. In fact, this training falls into place under awareness and training. And then also need to maintain the protection levels on the system. Now, what happens if those protection levels are defeated? And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We need to be able to detect that the system has an abnormal incident has occurred, and then you need to be prepared to respond correctly to that incident, have response plans prepared and the proper people trained so that they understand what to do and how to respond to an incident, and then finally how to recover operations back to normal use after the incident. So these 5 areas are the main functional areas that are included in all information security programs. And this goes to show you that information security is a very wide and broad subject, and we're going to give you a light 1-hour overview of this. One of the main things that needs to be communicated through this training is, first of all, how to identify what types of information in your workplace should be secured, and some best practices around securing that information. So first of all, we need to have an inventory of your assets. You need to be able to understand your assets and have an inventory of not only your systems, your hardware, your software, but also the most important data that lives on those systems, and classify that information. We're going to go through the next couple of slides some ways to classify information, because it's going to range from highly confidential all the way down to public. And so you need to figure out what parts of the information in your organization are confidential and what is not confidential. Once you classify your information, then you need to label the information and then understand how to handle that information properly. So here's some types of information. This is just a short little list of them. This is not conclusive of all types of information. But let's say you have employment records, salaries, maybe there's health information if you work in that field, background checks for employees. These are things that may not, should probably not be seen by everyone in the organization, or certainly not everyone on the internet. Credit card information, emergency planning information. These are types of information that should probably be classified, and then we'll tell you different ways to classify this information. In order to break down this classification of data and information for your industry, I'm going to ask David to come back up and talk a little bit.
As Jonathan was pointing out, the information in your organization, being public sector, is going to be slightly different than what a normal business private sector organization would use. And for most public sector, the majority of your records are going to be public records, so if they are compromised, while it is misappropriation of data, it's not necessarily sensitive the majority of the time. There are exceptions to this, of course. A high-end confidential item that may be executive level only or senior management, for public sector, you could consider executive session items or anything that's attorney-client privilege to fall into that the topmost classification. There may be some records in between access codes to your facilities that your operators may use and your engineers may use, which is not necessarily attorney-client, but it's not public record either. But these are some things to keep in mind when you're setting policies for labeling the classifications of the sensitivity of your information.
All right, thanks, David. So if you are the approved custodian of the information, then you're the person responsible for its protection. And you must safeguard this information at all times to ensure that the data is not lost or compromised or duplicated without your understanding. Unauthorized disclosure of classified information is punishable under federal crime statutes or organized policies. So that's why it's important to understand your role in the organization and what it takes to secure that information. So with that, let's go into some best practices for securing information, not just on paper, but also in digital form as well. So here are some examples of safeguarding information. Classified material should not be taken home because there is no way to ensure that your home has the same safeguards as your workplace. You must not work on classified information at home. Classified information shall not be disposed in the wastebasket. It has to be shredded. Also, email and internet may create opportunities for inadvertent disclosure of information. So before you send an email, before you post information to an online forum, make sure that you put it through your own mindset that is this data for public use or should it be classified or restricted. And also be familiar with your own organization's policies about internet use. If you have certain classified working papers such as notes, rough drafts, you're working on them, when you're not at your desk, they do need to be locked up. You can't just leave them in an open area. There's other forms or places where information can be stored, such as computer disks, CDs, DVDs, USB sticks, even on paper formats, such as carbon paper, or even old typewriter ribbons, if you're working on really ancient systems. All of these pose as an opportunity for a data leak, and we need to make sure that data that lives on those things have been classified and they're being handled properly. Some offices treat all items as classified, even though they're not necessarily at the same level. Also, we need to talk about the use of computers and communications and the internet. Your own organization probably has a policy. Make sure to follow your own organization's guidelines around that. If you don't have an organizational policy, you need to make sure to adopt one that fits your organization. When that information is no longer usable, and we're going to talk about destruction of media. So you can't just take a USB stick that you're using that had classified information and just toss it in the trash or hand it to someone else. So later in the slides, we're going to talk about the proper destruction of media. And then, but before we get started into segmented controls, I'd like to have David come up and talk to you about how layering these physical and cyber controls can be related to your industry.
So as Jonathan mentioned, your type of controls that you would have in your facility and location will vary depending upon what sector you're in. So if you're private sector, some of this would be a little different than public sector. So if you're public sector, for instance, you guys would have maybe an administrative building, maybe it's a critical infrastructure like a wastewater treatment plant, a water plant, lift stations, etc. And so when it comes to safeguarding those assets, there's two facets to it. There's physical access and logical access. So physical access controls would be access to the facility itself, and logical would be any digital access. So for instance, let's say this is a treatment plant of some sort. You have your perimeter, which would be your alarm system with sensors on it. This could be your security camera system and your DVR system that's monitoring the external perimeters of the area. And then there's different layers on top of that. For instance, there's the perimeter controls. Once your access to the facility is granted, you're in through the gates, and an interior control would be maybe a control room where you have chipped access or biometric access or keyed access that an operations or management company or a vendor might be accessing. And then a segmented interior control would be inside of the control room, maybe you have a server cabinet with keyed access to it. So that would be some public sector examples of some of these segregations of access controls. And so more specifically, when we talk about cybersecurity controls, there's different layers in that, and I'm going to defer to Jonathan here to go into details on that.
Thank you, David, for a good breakdown in the physical controls. Just as he talked about, where you're going to have layers between like your outer fence, locking the building, then locking the inner rooms or safes within the room. Network security and cybersecurity also has a layered defense in depth approach. So if there's specific data information that lives within an application that's been installed on a workstation or server that's attached to a network, all of those layers will have various means of securing access to those layers. For example, if you're on the internet, you're going to have to go through a firewall or VPN, probably a remote access token to get onto your interior network. And then once you're on that network, you'll have to log into a specific workstation or server and then open up an application, which probably will also ask you to log on as an operator or as an engineer, as a supervisor, then to access the data that lives within that application. So that's another example of a layered defense approach. Now, storing information is different than protecting access to that information. And we're going to talk about storing information and how that's different, both physical and logical, as you go between these different information security layers. So for example, the top confidential layer for information security, critical information that's been labeled as critical can never be kept out in public places. You can't keep critical drawing of a plant or a network drawing of a server farm or your network architecture on a wall in your building. You can't leave it where individuals that may not have access, that should have access to it, can inadvertently see it. So only the physical security controls have to be down to only the individual that can actually see it. Okay, so that's the highest level of confidentiality. When you get down to restricted level, this is where a group of people would have access to that information. So you can leave information in a certain room where that group of people have access to. You can, but you must store it in secured rooms or secured cabinets or safes where that group of people have the code to the safes or that group of people have a key to that cabinet. Okay, so you can't store information out in the public if it's restricted. For internal use, the information can be kept inside the building. It can be put on the walls. It could be left on a table inside the building as long as the building itself is locked away from the public. And then anything deemed public use can be left outside if you want, anywhere. For logically securing information, let's break down the same levels. So confidential information can never be stored on servers that can be accessed by the general public. They cannot be put on servers that can be accessed by your own internal employees even. So confidential data must be secured down to a role-based access control that only specific individuals can access. Confidential information stored on portable media such as USB sticks, hard drives, portable hard drives, those have to be secured with a password protection so that down to the individual level, and it should be encrypted so that only that individual that has the password can access that data. Those same basic rules also apply to the restricted level. However, those levels of protection such as passwords can be shared by a group, whatever group can be deemed that has access to that restricted information. When we get down to internal use information can be stored on your company's intraweb, can be put on your file print servers as long as an internal employee or vetted contractor can access that information. It's only one level up from the public, and then information that is deemed public use can be even stored up on a portal directly on the internet. Next, we need to talk about how to dispose of information that has been classified higher than public use. So let's first talk about printed information. So printed information has been classified at any level above public must be disposed in a way that the general public cannot access it. When we talk about logical ways of disposing information, this gets a little bit more complicated. Okay, so media that was used for storing confidential information must be disposed in a very specific way. Not only do you have to format the drive, but you also have to damage the physical media so that it cannot be restored to use, which means drilling through the hard drive with a power drill or throwing it into a fire. You have to damage the media so that it can never ever be retrieved off that device. Restricted information and media used to store that information can be disposed in the trash. It has to be formatted and overwiped with zeros, so more than just a basic format. You have to do a 3-pass overwrite with zero format of the drive. Also, you should not resell internal hardware used to store critical or restricted information on eBay or Amazon, because even though that drive has been formatted, someone else who purchases that drive might be able to use data retrieval tools to retrieve that information that was once stored on that drive. Media used for storing internal use information can be disposed of in working order, but should be formatted. And also, after formatting, the hardware should be disposed in the trash, should not be resold to others. And then media used for storing public use information can be thrown away in the trash, can be disposed, can be resold. There's no limits on what you do with media when you're done using it, when it's deemed public use. Let's jump into the second half of the course. We're going to start with defining terms such as threats, vulnerabilities, exploits, and also break down how a cyber incident happens. So let's start with the cyber security attack triangle. A lot of you guys probably remember back in your safety videos about the fire triangle, where in order to have a combustion, you need to have oxygen, heat, and fuel. And we're going to try to relate that to a cyber attack. And so in order to have a cyber attack, you must have a threat that uses an exploit to take advantage of a vulnerable system. If those three are present, then a cyber attack can happen. And so we don't always have the ability to stop threats, but we do have the ability to modify the vulnerabilities in our system and also limit exploits from reaching those systems. So if we take any leg of these fire triangle out, the fire is mitigated. The same principle applies with cybersecurity. So we're going to break down these concepts of threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, and so that you can understand how to best restrict these threats from accessing your information. Let's start with threats. Threats are typically either a people or an organization They have a certain type of motivation in mind, which we're going to get into when we talk about modeling threats. Vulnerabilities are deficiencies in the security of a system. It could be a vulnerability in a firewall, vulnerability in an application, vulnerability in a server. It could be even a vulnerability in a process that you're doing that involves people and procedures. Exploits are created by threats to take advantage of vulnerabilities. So I know these three terms may sound similar if you're not used to this industry, but remember that exploits are created by threats to take advantage of vulnerabilities. Also, the likelihood of a vulnerability getting exploited combined with the possible result or impact to the infrastructure is the risk. And we're also going to break down the term risk later in this slide deck as well for you. So let's look at these three aspects of the cyber attack triangle. Threats can never fully be mitigated. You know, there's always going to be another hacker out there. There's always going to be another group trying to attack something. So we don't really have a lot of control over threats. The threats are always going to be out there. But we can understand threat motivation. So we're going to go through a little threat diagram later in the slides to kind of break that down for you. Vulnerabilities can either be mitigated, they can be eliminated, they can be reduced, they can be managed. Vulnerabilities can never be transferred, which means those vulnerabilities are always on your systems. And mitigating vulnerabilities is where we have the biggest area of control in our system. We also cannot stop exploits. You know, there's always going to be another exploit being developed. We're going to break down kind of the methodology around why there's an exploit ecosystem out there. And the chance of an exploit being successful can also be reduced through deterrence or detectors. So basically we want to harden the system strong enough so that a motivated threat will take its exploit tools to the next potential victim. And that's really where we can reduce the chance of an exploit hitting your system. In computer security, a threat is a possible danger that might exploit a vulnerability to breach security and cause harm. Threats can either be internal to your organization or could be external. Threats could also have a threat to your system could either be natural, could be man-made. In the case of cyber attacks, that is typically a human or a group of humans working together to steal information or cause a cyber incident to a targeted system. Here's the typical threat classification tree. So whenever there's an incident, there's a team that's brought in typically to determine how the threat got in and how to restore operations quickly. And one of the first things that's done is to try to classify what type of threat was involved with the attack. Typically there's two, like we said before, either an internal threat agent or an external threat agent. That could either be an employee of the organization or a contractor. And the threat could either happen accidentally or intentionally. So you could have, for example, an employee that downloaded the wrong program to a controller in a water plant. That would be an incident that was caused by an employee that was accidental, and it was an internal. Okay, you could also have malware that hit a server on your business system and it started eating files because it was ransomware, and now they were trying to hold you ransom for money. That would be an external source, non-specific, that was propagating through the internet and it opportunistically found its way to your machine. So by understanding this threat classification, we can break down where that incident started. Okay, so as you can see, that classifying threats allows us to understand the motivation behind a cyber incident. Now, the threat motivation has also changed over time. If you go back to the early times, 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of these hackers were trying to do this for fun as a hobby. They're trying to see how they could break a system or change a system. For example, some hackers even found out how to take a floppy disk and to put a hole punch on the other side and make it double-sided, so they're getting better use out of a system. So the motivation was mostly curiosity. We had a lot of hobbyists that were hacking in this time. When we start in the early 2000 years, we started to see hacktivism, where different groups were hacking for a cause. Then as the second half of the first decade of 2000s came upon us, we started to see the motivation switch more around monetization. So a lot of hackers were putting themselves out as hackers for hire. And then as we see from 2011 onward, almost all cyber incidents now has either been political or money motivated. And so we're going to break down a couple of incidents for you so you can learn about how these have happened in the past. This incident happened to a power generation company in the US. Their NTP server was compromised and used as a spam relay. And when we did the threat breakdown tree for this was an accidental mistake by an internal employee. So a well-meaning employee basically wanted to connect his server to a good use of time. And why not use the internet? Because it's the best source for atomic clock, and all of his time systems will be synced properly. Well, by bypassing the firewall and allowing NTP protocol to get access directly from the internet, what that did was allow these spam bots that are going around the internet to find his server and then take over the server, turn it into a spam relay, and start spamming out email to on behalf of the spamming group. And so since that server was also used in the operations control room, then the operator started having slower refresh rates. There was bandwidth issues. The spamming server also was blacklisted by the domains DNS servers, so the company didn't have email either. So this was a very large incident that was just done by a well-meaning employee. That was an accident. So I'm going to give you a couple of little examples that should help you understand why following procedures, handling information properly, and making sure you're aware of these threats could help prevent these incidents from happening in your organization. Here's another example that happened in 2010. There was a series of incidents where data was being leaked from pipeline companies and chemical plants and processing facilities. This was a series of attacks that were all done the same exact way, so it was called a campaign. Some of the oil and gas companies and chemical companies, pipeline companies, did not know they were under attack even after a year and a half of the attack being underway. And so what these threat actors were after were executive emails, plant blueprints, ID diagrams, network diagrams, basically trying to get their hands on anything that would allow them to learn about how these systems work. You know, how to actually manage an oil and gas company, how to build their own chemical processing plant, how to run a water treatment facility, for example. In one of these cases, the purchase of a Chinese onshore processing facility was undercut by another company using the stolen emails and the financial data. So the motivation here was purely for competitive advantage. So a lot of times people will wonder, you know, why would someone want the information I have? And that's not always the best question to ask yourself, because the better question to ask is, how can I best secure this information so that no one else can access that information regardless of their motivation? In this case, this organization's had ineffective firewall configuration. They were not logging access to the firewall. They didn't have centralized logging, and they had a lack of security awareness within their organization. So that's how they were able to go for 18 months without detecting this threat agent. Now, in addition to your typical, firewalls and business systems and workstations and servers, we also need to worry about our phones. And all of us walk around with our own smartphones in our pocket, but we need to realize that now a lot of the threats are moving into the mobile space. Ever since 2012, we've had over 2,000 apps that were removed from the Android marketplace because they had Trojans. That basically what a Trojan is an application that appears to be one thing, but it's actually used in a way to subvert the information. This is an example of a Trojan application called Bowling Time. So if you downloaded this game onto your phone and played it, you can move your phone around, you could actually bowl and it plays the game. But while it's playing the game, the app is also digging into the other apps on your phone and sending out information outbound to the compromised server of the people who run this app, basically taking your username and passwords to Facebook, Instagram, your bank account access, anything that your phone can access, this app was accessing and sending it to the owners of the app. And the name of this was called Joy Dream. This is just one of many. So basically what we're trying to reinforce is that if you use a smartphone within your organization and you access critical information for your job, make sure you follow your own workplace policies for the applicable use and effective use of the smartphone for your business. And be careful about the applications that you download and run on your phone. And there's other threat vectors that these threat agents will use to access and compromise information. Lately it's been malware, worms, ransomware, phishing attacks. A phishing attack is when a threat agent or organization will send in an email into an organization pretending to be one thing, such as like maybe they might send an email saying, hey, join this new wellness program or this Going Green program within the organization, and you click on it, maybe there's a raffle to win a free iPad or something, right? You have to kind of be a little bit leery when you're looking at emails these days. If you're the back of your hair, your spidey sense starts standing up, it doesn't look right, don't proceed and click on links, because sometimes just clicking on the link will open up a portal on your system outbound to the internet where the threat actor can get back onto your machine remotely. There's also PDF files that can have droppers attached to the PDF file. So even just opening up a Word document or a PDF document machine could be part of a phishing attack. So make sure you validate where those emails are coming from and the individuals that are sending those to you. Mobile devices, we talked about smartphones, iPads, USB drives. If you find a USB stick somewhere lying around the office, or let's say you find one in the lobby, or you find one in a parking lot somewhere, and you don't know the source of that USB stick, don't plug it into your home computer, don't plug it into your work computer. You should report that to the person in your organization that's responsible for information security so she can test that device. Also, threat actors are using insecure builds, devices that are misconfigured or unpatched before activation. This gets into installation of hardware in your environment without being secured first. So, for example, if you buy a webcam or a security system, maybe one of those little door things you put on your door to your house, or even a Nest thermostat. All these things go outbound to the internet. You shouldn't just take those things out of the package, plug it in, turn it on, and start using it without doing your own research to properly harden and lock down those things.
So whenever it comes to phishing attempts and other exploits and vulnerabilities, one of them that's more common among our industry would be attachments that come via your email. So anytime you get an email in and it's from a trusted source, still look at what type of file it is. Be mindful of the suffixes. For those of you who don't know, it's the letters that come after the dot at the end of the file name. You can usually see them. Some of them, they all have a certain meaning. They identify with a specific file type. More often than not, you're going to see PDFs, which is the standard portable digital files that we use for agendas and meeting minutes and materials that will come in for public sector meetings. But if you see anything that looks unusual or suspicious, double check who it came from, maybe reach out to the originator of the email and say, hey, is this what you meant to send me, before you go opening them. An exe file, for instance, is a application that will run and that can do just about anything it wants half the time. So those are some things to be mindful of digitally. Also be mindful for physical files that come in. If it's even as something as simple as a fake water testing kit that comes in from the water company. I've seen these come in before, many of you may have as well. They appear to be something coming from the local water entity that's real generic looking. These are not generally trusted sources, and they normally are meant to subvert even residential water customers. So as a elected official, be mindful of what comes in digitally and what some of your constituents may be getting physically as well.
The threat actors are starting to increase their game. And in fact, I'm going to go through this as a quick example. The chief intelligence analyst for the control systems cyber program at DHS said that on a daily basis, the U.S. is being targeted. And in fact, they're targeting utilities a lot. She went to 17 different cities last year as she presented these statistics to various utilities. And she broke down attackers into 3 types. So first is the garden variety hacker, out for a thrill. The second is the daily assault of viruses, worms, and botnet attacks. This is never going to go away. Okay, we've always had this to deal with, and it's going to increase in the future. For example, if you take an unpatched Windows server and stand it up and plug it into your network without patching it, without installing its internal firewall and locking it down, the typical statistics is that within 9 minutes, it will collect a bot and actually start to be owned by someone else on the internet. That's just because these bots are automated and always going on the internet looking for open systems. So these two are always going to be here, okay? The third and most concerning type of attack is a nation-state attackers who are well-funded, and they've got a certain mission in mind to either subvert a system to learn about it, to harvest this information, and to build its own competitive advantage, or to have this access to the system so that a physical cyber attack can be pulled off in the future. We wanted to break this down for you so that you understand that when you're dealing with this information on a day-to-day basis, you may not think that it's that important to secure this information because it's the same benign information you're seeing every day when you're doing your job. However, by exposing you to what's going on out there in the real world, you'll understand that there's a lot of people motivated that may want to access that information for their own purposes. So that's why it's important to understand each element of a cyber attack. We first talked about threats. We said those threats aren't going away. They're always going to be there. We need to understand their motivation. Hopefully the slides we went through opened your mind to the type of threats that are out there. Next, let's jump into vulnerabilities, because this is where we have the biggest chance to prevent an attack. And in computer security, a vulnerability is a weakness which can be exploited by a threat actor to perform unauthorized actions within a computer program. Most vulnerabilities are due to unpatched systems, misconfigured systems, outdated firmware. So this would be devices that were essentially bought off the shelf, put in your environment, and not maintained properly, or systems that aren't getting patched on a regular basis. To exploit the vulnerability, an attacker must have at least one applicable tool or technique that can connect to a system weakness, and all it takes is one weak link in the chain. I'm going to give you a couple of typical vulnerabilities that we see out there, and these are things that probably exist in your organization, so you can learn from these. Flat internal networks not segmented into separate subnets. That would be, for example, what if you had a building where there was no fence before you get into the building. The building doors were always left open, and there were no locked doors within the building. So basically anyone from the public outside can walk directly into the building, into any room they want in the building. That's how some computer networks are set up. Sometimes a computer network is not segmented properly with firewalls and access controls, and once you get onto their internal network, you can access all the systems within the internal network with the same level of access. So some mistakes we find is when people would connect their PBX system or their voice system to the same computer network as their email, to the same computer network that has their internal security cameras, and the same system has their sensitive file and print servers, all on the same flat network. So once you get onto their internal network, you have access to everything. So that would be a vulnerability. Internal servers might have a modem or a backdoor. Maybe it has a remote access to that server for contractors to access that server, and that remote access has not been secured properly. Maybe there's internal servers that all share the same username and password. So let's say you've got 3 or 4 facilities out there, and using the same 3 letters of the name of your organization as the login and the password for every computer that's at every site. That would also be a vulnerability. Easy to guess passwords would be another one. Application protocols are also oftentimes in clear text without authentication or encryption. So these are just a few of the vulnerabilities that we see out there. Having an effective vulnerability management program is important. Asking your employer or your organization about how they effectively manage vulnerabilities is also important, and following vulnerability management policies. So this is why you may get a little pop-up on your desk from time to time that a patch is being downloaded or an antivirus is being updated. It's because that routine health hygiene of that system to keep it patched, keep it updated, is going to prevent these vulnerabilities from developing on the system. Let's now move into exploits, because we can't have a lot of impact over the threats. We definitely can reduce the number of vulnerabilities in the system. By understanding how exploits work, we can also reduce the chance of an exploit hitting our system through deterrents and detectors. So an exploit is a piece of software. It could be malware, it could be software that a hacker writes himself, or it could be a bug that the hacker buys from an exploit website. I'm going to talk a little bit about Exploit Hub and these sites where you can buy and sell exploits. But an exploit is essentially a program, a piece of software that is used by a threat to take over a vulnerability. And why is there such a big issue, an ongoing issue with exploits and threats, and cyber attacks seem to be going up and up and up each year? And that's because the exploits have been monetized, right? So we have nation states that are willing to pay very large sums of money for well-written exploits. The highest one I've seen go for has been over $250,000 that a nation state paid for one piece of software. We have the underground world that's still buying and selling exploits, and selling that into the criminal space. We have corporations such as HP, Google, Facebook. Almost all major corporations now will purchase exploits from hackers through bug bounty programs. So basically, in order to ensure their systems are secure, they'll say, hey guys, you go bang away at our systems, and if you find an exploit in Google Mail, for example, or if you find an exploit in a Facebook app and no one else has found it before, we're going to give you a certain amount of money, $20,000, $30,000. I think United just had a bug bounty program where a hacker found a vulnerability in the entertainment system, and they awarded him 1 million United miles for finding it. So they're trying to put like some rewards in for hackers to come forward with their exploits instead of selling it on these back market channels. So we have brokers, we have researchers and buyers. So it's a very layered system. And there's websites like Exploit Hub, which is similar to StubHub. So I know if you missed the chance to buy a concert ticket, you can buy it from someone else, and it connects buyers and sellers to each other. Well, Exploit Hub connects exploit writers, hackers that are writing exploit code, to exploit buyers who want to purchase that code and use it for their nefarious reasons. And so there's a lot of reasons why the Benjamins keep flowing into this space, and it's because the exploit field has been monetized. Now, the effect or the impact of exploits can be minimized through detection and defense mechanisms. So like we said before, we're never going to stop the exploit world from generating more exploits every day. but we can do some things on the inside of our organizations to detect a potential exploit and respond appropriately. And we're going to look at two types of deterrences, an active defense and passive detection. So let's break this down in a way that we can all understand it. On my way here to record this training session for you, for example, I locked my car, and I set the alarm on my car, right? So the physical lock on my car is an active deterrence. When an attacker walks up to my car and grabs the handle, he sees that it's locked. Hopefully they'll move on to another car. If they're really motivated to break into my car and they try to jimmy the lock or break in or break the glass, then the alarm system should be the detection method or the compensating control that allows me to know that the fact that they've broken into my car, right? So we can relate that to cyber defense and cyber detection systems. So having firewalls and banners on your systems, when you log into a machine and it brings up a banner and says, unauthorized users will be prosecuted. Those are all kind of like the locks on your car saying, hey, this is an access control method. You're not supposed to go past this. Now, if those outer controls are defeated and someone does get on the inside, and you need to have a detection system in place to back up your deterrent system. And in the logical cyber world, that usually involves intrusion detection systems and logging systems. So by having intrusion detection systems in place on the inside of your network, you can monitor abnormal network performance, abnormal patterns that's happening on the machines, and those alerts can be sent to someone in your organization who is being designated to be the first line of defense. This also allows you to historically trend your system performance so you can see any abnormal use of the system. So let's look at the term cyber risk. Cyber risk commonly refers to any risk of a financial loss, disruption, damage, or reputation of an organization resulting from the failure of its information systems. So let's break down risk even further. Risk is not determined by threat motivation, right? So sometimes people will say, well, I don't have any cyber risk because why would someone want to target me, right? That's the wrong place to start from a mindset, because what we've seen is that over 90% of cyber incidents, the victim wasn't even the target involved. The exploit was written and deployed on a network, and it propagated onto other networks and systems that were affected by that exploit, but they weren't even their initial target. So risk is really determined by a combination of system susceptibility, so basically unhardened or unmanaged assets, the threat accessibility, so can the threat access that application or that server through a vulnerable architecture or weak configurations or a lack of technical controls. So basically, if the system assets are vulnerable to exploitation, they've not been patched, they're misconfigured, so there is a vulnerability present, the threat can access those assets with relative ease, then the system is at a high-risk state. And this diagram kind of helps bring it in visually for us. So this covers your system susceptibility. We can reduce this by reducing the number of vulnerabilities in our system, right? So by patching your systems on a regular basis, by having the right logging systems in place, by doing preventive maintenance on your system, by also having physical security and having physical guards and cameras. These are all reducing your system susceptibility. You can also reduce the ability of the threat to get access to those systems by putting additional controls in place in front of the threat. We don't have control over the threat capability, right? Because they're always developing new tools, new techniques, they're always accessing more resources, developing more exploits. So this is where we can really reduce our threat surface, is up here at this top part. So lastly, now let's focus on, if I am able to detect that my system has been compromised, then what are the following procedures that I should follow after? And let's keep in mind that it's everyone's responsibility to detect and report threats, right? I took this picture myself when I was doing a security assessment. And so obviously this guy was falling down on the job, but we don't want to be like that guy, right? It requires observant people, all of us working together to make sure that we detect potential threats. On the physical side, here's some tips and techniques, right? So break-ins by burglars are possible because of vulnerabilities in the security system. You know, sophisticated criminals plan a burglary. You know, they know when you're there, when you're not there. They do dry runs, you know, to see what your response time is. You know, only opportunistic burglars act on the spur of the moment, right? So in the majority of cases, commercial burglary is carried out because there are no proper detection in place. You know, they're missing certain camera angles, so the criminals know they can get away with it. There's a gap between detection and response. Right, so they've tried it a few times and they know that if the detection system goes off, the alarm sounds, well, it's going to be 15 minutes before the cop arrives, so let's just put hoods on our faces, rob the place, and get out before the response time's there, right? So in other scenarios, you know, former employees will use their credentials to enter a company's facilities. So if you don't quickly take away someone's access controls to a facility, that's another gap in your physical security program. How that relates to you guys would be, you know, a lot of these treatment facilities and plants have fences with, you know, pin codes in it. They're very simplistic, you know, like 1, 3, 4, 5 or something. And when you no longer use a specific contractor, or maybe an employee is fired, how often do you go back and remove all those different little physical dip switches and changes in all of your keys for all your cabinets? You know, and change all of, and it's more than just, you know, turning off their logical account access on their computer and their email. Any physical access that they had or knowledge of PIN codes or security keys, that all has to be changed as well. So if we continue down the physical side, be aware of coworkers and approved contractors in your workplace. If you don't recognize a person that's in your workspace, there's nothing wrong with asking for identification or asking them, hey, how you doing? Can I help you with something, right? By putting someone on the spot, by asking them, that's going to make someone feel uneasy if they're not supposed to be there. You can kind of read their response back to you. You know, be particularly wary of individuals that appear not to be familiar with their workspace. If they're walking down a hallway that's a dead end, or they're trying to do a door that's locked, or they're trying to go in a place that doesn't have anything in that room, you know, you might want to say, hey, are you supposed to be in this part of the building, or you should be in here? So if you do see any suspicious activity, report that to the proper personnel in accordance with your organization's security policy, because a lot of time it's those individuals that are the first line of defense. On the cyber side, here's a couple of typical threats that we've talked about during this training. Malware, you know, malicious software that gets into your computer and then starts to do other things than what was designated for that application. So this could be, you know, scamware, spyware, Trojans. It could be mining for cryptocurrency on your computer. You know, those are all threats. Even though it may not be stealing information, it's slowing your computer down. It's harvesting resources from your system. Phishing would be specific threats where an organization is trying to elicit a response from you to click on a link. When you click on that link, it will download a dropper onto your machine to allow them to have remote access to your machine. Or they may ask you to register for something, and by you putting in your username and password into that registration process, now they have what could be your actual username and password for your system. Spear phishing is similar to phishing, although it's designated phishing for specific personnel in the organization. This would be also called whaling. So this is for like specific CEOs or CFOs or high net worth people. They might have a specific targeted phishing attack, which would be a spear phishing attack. Man in the middle attacks would be where an attacker tries to intercept communications in the middle. Sometimes this would be by planting devices in place. So if you're walking around your workspace and you see, like, you know, the table's been pulled away from the wall, and there's a weird looking device with some antennas hanging off it, you probably should ask questions about that. Sometimes they'll plant devices out in a fenced area, out in a treatment facility, out in a lift station area. You see some weird random RF communications or antennas or hardware placed somewhere. It could be that someone is trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack to basically scrape information from the system before it gets harvested by the back end. Trojans and ransomware. This has been a real big problem this past year. This is basically, a Trojan would be any type of software that's disguised as something else. Ransomware would be another version of a Trojan designated to compromise data, encrypt data, and cause you to pay someone money in order to get your data back. Ransomware is a form of a Trojan, but it's been designed in order to elicit a monetary response. Also, denial of service attacks, which are also called DOS, or distributed denial of service attacks, which is DDoS. This is when a large number of machines harvest their bandwidth and their processing power all at once to overwhelm the bandwidth capabilities of a system. And that would be when, let's say you go to someone's website and it's down. It's because someone is doing a denial of service attack to that website. There's also attacks on IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. And I know in our utility industry, we're starting to see a lot of uptake in smart meters and metering out at the home. And as I talked about this before, in terms of like Nest thermostats, little personal security cameras, all these things are Internet of Things devices that all connect back to the home internet system. We need to make sure that those devices are installed properly, that the passwords, default passwords have been changed, and that their firmware has been updated with the latest firmware and the latest patches. Data breach would be a security incident, specifically in where information is accessed illegally. Some of the latest breaches that we saw last couple of years would be like, the Target breach, where millions of customers had identity theft just because data was leaking outbound from the point of sale devices. Having property detection in place would prevent that by knowing when your outbound information traffic is going above the norm. And malware on mobile apps, and we talked about that before. Even device applications on your smartphone can be compromised. So here's some best practices and tips for identifying these cyber threats. We talked a lot about email because that is still the predominant way that these threats are coming in. In fact, I think they said over 72% of attacks that were ransomware came in through internal employees that clicked on emails they shouldn't have clicked on. So do not click on emails, do not come from verified sources. Be cautious and keep in mind potential phishing attacks. Do not insert USB sticks or mount portable hard drives in your work computer without following your procedures. Make sure it's approved by your organization. Do not install applications on your smartphone or your tablet or your work computer or even your home computer unless it's approved by your organization. Especially if you're using your home computer to access your work through a VPN, because anything that's on your home computer can now come through that VPN into your work network. So be cautious about installing applications. If a system or application starts to operate slower than normal, you should start to ask some questions. Maybe report that through a help ticket or however you get your support for your systems. A lot of times, a very slow device or slow application would be a telltale sign that it's been compromised. And report any suspicious activity concerning your device or application following the proper procedures of your organization.
So as Jonathan had pointed out some specific threats and how to respond to them, in public sector, a lot of you guys are going to encounter some of these things, but not all of them. But I wanted to make clear a few items that may be useful to you. Obviously, the emails are very sensitive, and as we had mentioned before, if you're using your personal devices to do any public business, that's generally discouraged anyway. And if it is sensitive and you are doing the same business on your personal devices, not only does that increase the risk of threat, but it can also increase the likelihood of a public information request gaining access to your personal information. So if you're doing public business on your home PC or even your phone, be very mindful of that. The ideal scenario is to have dedicated hardware provided by your organization that can be professionally managed by not only an IT professional, but with well-established communications policies, security policies, and a lot of these can be configured in advance so that you don't have to necessarily be as mindful of some of these items because your environment's already been secured by your authorized personnel. Another instance would be if you are seeing any of these threats and they are obvious to you, or you're starting to notice any of the byproducts or manifestations of any of these bullet points that you've gone over, please be sure that you report that to either cybersecurity personnel, your legal counsel, your communications department, whatever the appropriate entity is, to ensure that you're being diligent about reporting any sort of potential threats that you may observe that could potentially put you guys at risk. So that concludes the end of our training. If you have any questions about any of the content, or if there's any questions you have about adoptions of policies, and some professionals that you could get in touch with that might help alleviate some concerns or improve your organizational security standards, we're available for questions, and we thank you for your time, and congratulations on completing the training.